war against the U.S. in just a matter of months, according to my guest today. But are they acting out of strength or desperation? With mounting problems at home, food shortages, economic turmoil, population collapse, and political unrest, not to mention the millions of armed patriots here in the U.S., is China really a threat, or is it falling apart at the seams? All this and more on today's show. Welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Hullhouse. Joining me today, an interview I'm so excited for, is J.R. Nyquist, a geopolitical expert, journalist, and author who's been sounding the alarm about China and communism for decades. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you. Apologize to everyone for the little technical glitches and the late start. It somehow seems that whenever we have the most important things to do, that there's some sort of interference. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go ahead. Before we start, why don't you just jump in, give me a little bit of background. You've been exposing communism, especially its threat against America, for quite some time. How did that come to be for you? How did you get into this?
Well, I was in graduate school 33 years ago, and I discovered that there were communists. They were real. They were active. They wanted me to join them. I did not believe in Marxism, so I couldn't. And I got really interested in what they were doing. And of course, I started reading defector literature, started trying to figure out how this thing worked. And I had a kind of epiphany. The defector literature, people who've come from their system to ours, is kind of prophetic. When you read them, like Anatoly Golitsyn, for example, in 1984, he said the Soviet Union would fake its collapse, the Warsaw Pact would go away, the Berlin Wall would go down, the Communist Party would give up power in the Soviet Union, but he said it would be controlled liberalization. It would be fake. And if the West believed it, you were then on a path to what he called the West weakening its guard, and then the Russia and China would be getting together, building up their forces for what he called the period of one clenched fist, when they would come in to go in and finish off the United States.
Wow. Which, now, when you say one clenched fist, so we've got, I think a lot of the focus has been on China. I think a lot of the, especially the more mainstream media, has created a boogeyman out of Russia. But who do you see as the real combined threat? Is it really the communist bloc around the country that's uniting with, Venezuela, Cuba, et cetera? Who's really together in this against us?
There's an important game. You have to understand the bag of tricks strategy. Like chess players, you have different openings, you have different strategies. You've got the hyper modern style, and the modern style, you've got traditional openings. Well, there's something called divide and conquer going on here. And I will point out, you just mentioned this, you're going to have people like saying Trump was a Russian puppet. You got people like Patrick Buchanan saying that Putin's a good guy, Putin's a Christian, he wears a cross and stuff. That's all phony baloney. Putin is not a Christian. That is nonsense. I've talked to people from St. Petersburg who know him. He's not a Christian. He's a communist. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not as it was advertised. And what is happening now is the Russians and Chinese are playing a scissor strategy, a divide and conquer strategy in which they play each side of the divide. For example, about the India-Pakistan war. China came in and took the side of Pakistan. Soviet Union came in and took the side of India. So they're using that conflict to control each of the people in that conflict. Now, how it works here is you've got the Russians are working the right side of the street, convincing people on the right that the Russians are their friend. And meanwhile, the Chinese, these ladies that were running Black Lives Matter were Marxist trained, Chinese Marxist trained. You've got Antifa with its connections to China. So you've got the left working with, and Biden saying, oh, the Chinese are good people, we need to work with them. So you have this left, right, blue state, red states, Russia, China. They've divided and they're playing both sides of the street. The great thing is that in this division, you can then, let's say if they cause a civil war here, which was that the KGB Colonel Igor Panarin was talking about in 1998, that the U.S. could divide up, and then there could be foreign intervention. Well, if you look at this foreign intervention thing, if you can have people who are killing people on the blue state side and killing people on the red state side, but they kill the ones that aren't agents under control of Russia and or China. And Russia and China, that's how this blades of the scissors close. There's two blades in the scissors, and you bring the blades together against another thing.
It's
See?
it's
So the
the art
blades
of
aren't
war,
really fighting
even
each
the
other.
the
Yeah,
pincer formation.
right. It's a strategy. The Russians and Chinese as strategists, they use this strategy, and it's a super one. It's the biggest one we've ever seen. And what they rely on is that we don't think there's a communist bloc. We don't think it's about communism. We don't think that Russia and China are united. We think they're enemies. And the thing is you can talk to I can show documentary evidence and defector testimony till I'm blue in the face. People are stuck in these narratives that are guiding them towards this division,
Mm.
dividing the country and damaging the country. But these two countries over here, look, who released the pandemic on us? It came from China. They timed it for Chinese New Year. Look at that. They had to incubate it in the city of Wuhan, the hub of China, right till you get to Chinese New Year's, the greatest travel day in the world, where people from the Chinese diaspora come into Wuhan for the New Year, and then they all go out to Australia, North America, Europe, and spread that pandemic. That was not an accident.
Well,
That
it's
was not
interesting
an
that you mentioned
accidental
that,
leak. Yeah,
because one of my frustrations with the mainstream media, and even a lot of the more less mainstream conservative media, is that they're really stuck on the discussion of, was this something from nature or did it come from a lab? Where if you look at in 2015, the book published by the PLA about a bioweapon, and even if you look at, which this was very eye opening to me, and I've got here in front of me the speech given by General Chi Haotian in 2005 talking about a biological attack. So they've been talking about this for a long time. And what is a little bit frustrating is that, why is the discussion not, this is a biological attack. Why are they doing this? Who's behind it? And what is the next step? What is this the precursor for?
right. Look, the good news is that the weapon didn't work the way they wanted. You
Well, it was
notice
made
that
in China.
right, it was made in China. That's a very good. The communists always have these missteps. Today, for example, is June 22nd. Very important day to remember, because Stalin had orchestrated World War II beautifully. He had made his pact with Hitler in August of 1939 so Hitler could invade Poland with him. Then he let Hitler go ahead and invade Poland. He said, "Oh, I'm running a little late." And then Russia and France declared war on Germany for invading Poland. Whereas if Soviet Union had gone in with it, they couldn't have declared war. So Hitler thought, "Oh, the Allies can't declare war on me. They'd have to declare war on Soviet Russia too." But he went in and he's like, "Well, where are the Russian troops? They're supposed to be invading." And so he ends up. So here's Stalin laughing because his enemies, the West, uh, Great Britain and France, are at war with Germany, and he's just sitting back watching. But how did his plan blow up? Is Hitler realized he'd been double dealt. He realized by the way they were behaving, the diplomats, the Russian diplomats. So he turned the Wehrmacht around on the 22nd of June. He surprise attacked Stalin, right? Wiped out a whole bunch of Soviet armies. Russians were defecting over to his side because they hated Stalin so much. So they had this big debacle, right? Hitler almost won the war right then, because the Russians, the communists, make these kind of mistakes. And so with release of this virus, you have a similar thing. They have this great thing. It creates micro blood clotting in the lung. It cuts off oxygen for the red blood cells. It's like a combination of you know this SARS COVID bat virus with HIV and malaria.
Yeah, attacks
And
the
it's
immune system.
yeah, it does all kinds of things. But the problem was, as this Nobel laureate said last year, uh, chimera viruses that are made in labs, they rapidly mutate towards the common cold, right? So they become even more transmissible, but less harmful. So you have all these deaths forward loaded at the beginning. You had young people dying, dentists, doctors, nurses dying in northern Italy and Wuhan. And then all of a sudden, it just wasn't killing young people anymore because it was losing its oomph. But they had to keep the panic going because it
They had to
was
keep the same narrative. The mechanism of that narrative had to keep going, which is why you have in places like Australia, you have complete lockdowns over 15 cases in an entire
right.
state.
Because it's also an economic attack. It's an attempt to besiege our economic system and wear it down and bankrupt us and cause social anarchy. That's why in the middle of the pandemic, you had these communist mobs running through our streets, tearing down statues of Teddy Roosevelt and George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant, the one in San Francisco, for example, tearing down the statues. Black Lives Matter running through, looting stores, burning what they burnt and looted, 1-2 billion dollars worth of damage. And they were saying defund the police. Well, these are all communist slogans. This is
Yeah,
all this is all very obviously
it's
communist.
textbook.
Textbook, right. And so you got the fifth column activated. And at the same time, the biological attack, you notice, once it started taking off in the United States, the Chinese started getting nervous. They started mobilizing. And then you saw armored columns moving towards the coast opposite Taiwan. You had these increase in air sorties. You had naval mobilizations. You had, and the same thing in Russia. You had the Russian government was fired even before they knew, at the beginning of January last year, which was really a dead giveaway. It's like, what's going on? They just fired their whole government. Well, they were putting them underground. They were having two governments, one set of officials under in bunkers, another one out front in case, because American policy is you do a bio attack on us, we nuke you.
We nuke you.
We nuke you. And I had intelligence from people in other communist countries that those communist countries had been instructed by Russia and China to rotate a large percentage of their leadership in and out of bunkers, nuclear war bunkers, in case the US just came unglued and said, all right, you did this to us, we're hitting you back. Because they started a war. They committed an act of war on the US with a biological weapon.
Which also makes sense. And as we talked about before, there's certain topics surrounding November 3rd that we can't go too into detail with, but it makes sense why they couldn't have Trump in office. Because if anything, they're accusing him of starting wars, whereas he was just standing up and not just bowing down, which is the opposite of what you see happening now under Biden, especially if you look at what happened in G7 with Putin, et cetera.
It's very interesting to mention this. Yeah, Trump had backed them into a corner in the trade talks, and they were taking damage. Now, this Hong Kong businessman, who's one of my sources, he said that the original plan, the Chinese plan, was to start the war in 2035. They believed they were going to pass us militarily in 2027. But because of the damage that Trump had done to their economy, and because they were ahead in their military building program, they were actually saw themselves in a better position, and they'd really infiltrated our society. Um, they were in a position where they thought, we have to do something now. So they decided to go ahead with this biological attack now rather than on their original timetable. And what this businessman said is that this within months they're going to war with us because that is built in, that's baked into this cake. Once they unleash the bioweapon, it's a matter of months before it eventually evolves because either we wake up and realize we're in a war with them, or they have to, before we rearm, before we get ready, they have to proceed to the next steps. So this is why this is extremely dangerous. And of course, their plan is partly fallen apart because the virus didn't work exactly the way they wanted. We don't also know the follow-up to the virus. Is there another biological attack disguised as a variant of this that they're going to try to say, oh, it's just a mutation, but it's just a new weapon that they've deployed? We don't know how that will play out. There's also the questions about the vaccine. We've got a lot of people being injured and reporting, and there's a lot of controversy. So we don't know what the vectors are. Biological war can be very complicated, and especially when you've got these massive institutes in Russia and China dedicated to studying these things that they've been working on this for decades. Chi Chen, the former defense minister of China 20 years ago, gave a secret speech that the plan was a surprise biological attack on the United States that would kill 100 to 200 million Americans and would pave the way for them. Because what China really wants, and I know this from the defector Stanislav Lunev, In 1991-92 area, China and Russia negotiated a future war plan against the United States, where Russia would take Alaska and parts of Canada, and China would get the lower 48. And the Chinese really negotiated for that lower 48. And in Chi Hao-chen's secret speech, he talks about this. We gave away territory to the north to the Russians so we could secure this land, these lower 48 states to build a second China
To
inside
colonize
the
America,
yes,
basically.
because look, you got 1.4 billion people in China, it's the size of the United States, but China's very arid. It's a very dry country. Asia is much drier than North America. And so they despite the floods they're having, right, the last year and now this year again. But what they've really got the problem with is that they've polluted their environment, they've destroyed the water table, they can only feed about half their people with their domestic food imports. And there's this thing also happening called the grand solar minimum, where the sun's electromagnetic field is collapsed. And this is the indication that we're going into a modern minimum where global temperatures are going to cool. The growing season is going to shorten. All this food that's being grown by the European Union and Russia and Canada that are feeding all these, like the Arab countries that also are arid and don't have enough arable land. So you're looking at massive shortages of food. China won't be able to pick up the food for the 700 million of their people on the world market. They need land, and they need to move people out of China, and they need to prevent a collapse of their country, both economically and in terms of food, which would cause a revolution. Every time in history that during the modern minimum, there were peasant uprisings in China, horrible bloodshed, cannibalism, mass starvation. They know
And
what's
food
coming
was
to
always
China.
central to that.
Absolutely central to it. And so they know they're facing this. And this is so when you ask at the beginning of the show whether this is desperation or strength, they got tremendous strength right now, but they also have tremendous desperation
Mm.
because last year with the massive flooding, there were whole provinces in China that lost their rice growing. All 3 seasons, I understand, were lost. They had late spring freezes, which is part of this grand solar minimum, and it's just beginning. 10 years from now, it's going to be pronounced. Nobody's going to talk about global warming 10 years from now. It's going to be a dead issue. That's just complete nonsense. And so they know food growing, and we got 7.7 billion people. We're not going to be able to feed 3 or 4 billion of those people when this thing really settles in 10 to 15 years. And so they've got to solve their problem. And this negotiation they made with the Russians in 1991, getting the lower 48, this becomes more imperative. They can't wait to 2035. They have to move early for like these multiple reasons I've stated, because of Trump, because of the modern minimum, sorry, the the grand solar minimum. So therefore, they pushed the button on this, and they moved the ball forward, and they need to get. You saw the thing about Kyle Bass discovering this the Chinese PLA general who's a billionaire in Texas bought 200 square miles to build a wind farm, and he's building a 10,000-foot runway,
Yeah. It's
which
not
can
suspicious
accommodate.
at all.
Yeah, no, it's not suspicious. You can't land Chinese troop transports there, and then the reports of Russians down on the border in Mexico working with the cartels, rumors coming out of the former Soviet Union that Spetsnaz has worked out a deal to move soldiers into the United States, commandos across the Mexican border, the cartel to smuggle them. I mean, the stuff that's coming out now, it's just one thing after another, and of
Do you
course,
think that
yeah.
quick question for you? Because something that you had talked about in your interview with Mike Adams, and also you've written about, is specifically in an article you posted on your blog, actually, the Invasion America, talking specifically about the southern border and the work with the Cubans and the cartels, and obviously with China and Russia. Do you think that that's one of the major reasons why Trump was pushing so hard to build the border wall, and why he kept talking about securing our southern borders, because he saw the impending plan to use the southern border to mobilize Chinese and Russian troops into America?
Yeah, of course, the southern border is to infiltrate these small commando units in advance of a war and to infiltrate WMDs. I mean, what Colonel Stanislav Lunev emphasizes that Russia, for example, was maintaining secret stockpiles of munitions, And one of the tasks he had was, and he testified before Congress on this, was that to set up places where they could bring nuclear weapons into the United States and maintain them in secret stockpiles to unleash them internally. And then what Lunev told me is the plan was to pawn this off as if it was Arab terrorists doing it, like we were being attacked by ISIS or, you know, um, uh, you know, Osama bin Laden. Well, he's dead, but one of these
Al-Qaeda, et
terrorist
cetera. Yeah.
organizations, you know,
The Islamic boogeyman that they always
the
use
Islamic, yeah,
to shift
exactly.
blame away from, talk about the fact that those are mostly KGB funded terrorists anyway.
Right. Well, you had Alexander Litvinenko who drank the polonium-laden tea and died of radioactive poisoning. He was a defector from the KGB, uh, successor organization, the FSB. And what he came when he defected, and he came out with this later, closer to when they killed him. This is probably why they killed him. Is he was saying, look, I was responsible for Ayman al-Zawahiri's security and when he was trained in Russia in '96. So, when you look at Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's number two guy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was trained in Russia. And Litvinenko said that other Al-Qaeda leaders were trained in Russia and that the whole attack on the World Trade Center was a Russian operation. And Litvinenko, it's like 15 months later, he drinks the polonium tea and dies. And we all saw the horrific pictures of how he died of radiation poisoning. He said Putin did this to me. And they did. The Scotland Yard, they traced the polonium radioactivity leaked on the plane, the Lufthansa that he took all the way from Germany back to Moscow. Lugovoy was the name of the guy that brought the polonium. He was one of Putin's bodyguards, an FSB guy. So it's like this plot thickens massively. They have these different diversionary operations like the War on Terror. This is described by Viktor Suvorov. That's the pen name of Vladimir Rezina, a GRU defector who wrote a very famous book called Spetsnaz. And he talks about infiltrating the border with Spetsnaz, deployments before a war, but he talks about Great Terror, in which the West is attacked by a terrorist organization that doesn't seem to have any ties with Moscow, and that it diverts all the security and all of the military assets of the West away from Russia to this other
Middle
enemy.
East, we see.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a diversionary thing. And this is preliminary to the buildup to the war. So this is not only the Sino-Soviet split deception, the collapse of the Soviet Union deception, we're not communists anymore, and Putin starts wearing a cross, it's just phony baloney. He doesn't believe it for a second. And then you've got the stuff going on in China where we're building them up, and all of a sudden every year they're building a navy the size of the French Navy, adding to their fleet, every year. So now we find ourselves in this terrible pickle where we're outnumbered. They're lined up against us, and we're hit with a pandemic. And by the way, if you read Suvorov's book, 1987, he wrote it, Spetsnaz, he says that before the war, there will be a rapidly spreading viral pandemic. It's right there in the book.
Wow.
Defector literature, whether it's Golitsyn or it's Suvorov or it's my friend Colonel Stanislav Lunev, is prophetic. And you say, what, did they have a crystal ball? No, they knew military plans. They knew what the plan was. And so since they do deviate, they are continuing to improve it and improvise, but you know where they're going, you know what their methods are, you can track it. And it's been fairly easy for me to do, but it's extremely frustrating to see that other people refuse to do it. Oh, now Russia and China, they're enemies. They'll never trust each other. And it's like, oh no, Al-Qaeda, it's a whole thing. We've got to have troops in Afghanistan. Finally, they got wise and they're pulling them out. But we've been fooled and tricked on every front.
Yeah. Now, and with the virus, because I've been tracking it, trying to understand it since the very beginning, and now you have a lot more information. You see with the Fauci emails, et cetera. One question, actually two questions that I have for you is, one is, what do you believe Fauci's role to be in this overall? And two, why would the United States be funding China's biological weapons program against the United States?
Well, remember, it wasn't the United States, it was some officials who we know now are corrupt, right? And who had ways of lining their pockets, like Fauci. What is this with Fauci and having uh, the legal right to profit from some of these technologies? Look, it's very easy for the Chinese to appeal to the greed of an American official. And there's such a thing as bribery and blackmail. Once an official is compromised, they own him. Once an official is bribed, I mean, we've got a lot of corruption in our system, unacknowledged corruption. And you've got, when you've got drug trafficking, look, my friend Joe Douglas wrote the book Red Cocaine. Chinese and Russians got involved in drug trafficking. The Russians called it Operation Friendship of Nations. They launched it in 1960 after doing 5, 6 years of studies. And they found the most
It's
important
like
thing
the
about
opium trade under Mao.
right. Mao said we need to launch an opium war against the West. Stalin kind of blew him off, but Khrushchev came back after Stalin's death and said, "Wait a minute, Mr. Mao, you got a great idea there. We could really do this upright." And what the Russians found out, the most important thing about drug trafficking was not that it messed up our youth and corrupted our society in that sense, but it was the money laundering in the banks. The money they figured would be too much for banks. Once you get money laundering in a bank, what, you control the bank because you can put the bank officials into jail because they've done what? So now they're part of your mafia. And of course, now you're saying, oh, we're just the Russian mafia. Russian mafia, you're talking about a police state. If you're in the Russian mafia, the KGB got you out of jail and sent you to America. This is an intelligence operation. Same thing with the triads. You go back to it's called the Sidewinder Report in Canada. Sidewinder Report in Canada said Chinese triads are a lie. They actually have treaties with the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese government and the Chinese intelligence services. And they go into Canada, they come in through Vancouver, and it's about drugs, it's about smuggling people, it's also about infiltrating and bribing and corrupting the Canadian government, because Canada then is a way to flank the United States, to come into to America's flank.
So is
Same
that
thing with
why
Mexico.
you're
Yeah.
seeing with Canada in particular, you're seeing Trudeau that I mean, a couple of years back, I imagined Canada to be our very free, peaceful neighbor to the north, whereas now you're seeing Canada arresting pastors, I mean, implementing draconian lockdowns. And is this all just because they're just another pawn of the communist nations?
Well, let me tell you something about Prime Minister Trudeau. His father was Prime Minister of Canada when I was a little boy. You may not be old enough. When I was in the fifth grade, my fifth grade teacher was very left wing, and he loved to talk about Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada. And this is, now I'm giving my age away. This was in the late 60s. Trudeau's family's best friend was Alexander Yakovlev. Alexander Yakovlev was the Soviet ambassador. I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of Prime Minister Trudeau's brothers is named Alexander, named after Alexander Yakovlev. This
You can't
tells
make
you
this up.
these people are close to and Alexander Yakovlev was like this with Gorbachev and creating this fake collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of Leninism. But of course, if you read the defector literature, if you read Galitzin, if you read Shana, this collapse was prepared decades in advance. And former CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton was talking about this, was trying to warn people. They called him a Cassandra within the CIA. They went, and later our mainstream media went and destroyed those people's reputations. Angleton and Galitzin saying they were mentally ill. Right? That's the best way to destroy somebody's reputation, is to say that they're mentally ill. To prevent our counterintelligence from being effective, to prevent the strategic warning that this is their strategy. When I first heard about this strategy, I thought, oh, they could never do this, because now that it's out in public, our people would recognize it and they would stop it. No, but I didn't understand how dumb people were, how stuck in narratives they were, how when I was in graduate school, I saw these people prepping to go to work at the CIA and the State Department and the Rand Corporation, and it's like they all had blinders on. And you couldn't really, just like today, when you try to tell people, look, what I want to tell people right on your show is that whether you're on the right or the left on America, don't be divided. Americans should never fight Americans. We should work things out in our democratic process. We got a great constitution. These enemies are trying to get us to fight. They wanted the election to be so screwed up that we would end up in a civil war. Look at that war game. that John Kerry and John Panetta did back in the fall, where those three Western states, you got blue states seceding because in their war game, Michigan was up for grabs and it was going to decide the election in their pre-election war game. And so what really got me was that Oregon, California, and Washington State seceded from the Union. And I'm thinking, you got all the blue states in the Union you could pick from, and you pick those three in your war game.
It's
Why are you
strange, the
picking
three
those three
coastal.
states? Not Illinois, not New York, not Connecticut. What are you doing? Wait a minute. Those are the three states that face China, where all those ships from China come in. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking, all those politicians in China, they're just like this with the Chinese, right? San Francisco's like this Chinese enclave, and they all come out of San Francisco and they go to Sacramento. And it's like, uh-oh, is this going to be, do they want the election to be all screwed up so that there can be this, the right wing folk and the left wing folk? We already have the Antifa and the Black Lives Matter in the streets. We're going to get right wing people in the streets, and then we get people shooting at each other, and then we have a divided country, and then we have states, they were probably thinking Trump was going to win the election, so because they overdid certain things. So all of a sudden, you have these states seceding, and then what happens? You have a civil war, and they invite Chinese troops in to help them. And then if the right think that the Russians are good, right, we've got this split in the street, right? The Russians work in the right side of the street, the Chinese the left. We get a right-left split in America. Chinese troops come in, Russian troops come in. What's happened? We've been invaded. We don't even realize it. We think they're each side. If you're on the left, you think the Chinese are here to help. If you're on the right, you think the Russians are here to help. No, they're not here to help. They're invading us, and they want to wipe us out.
Ah, interesting. So that then makes sense if you look at the southern border of California, because I've been hearing reports even up to a year ago about weapons caches in government buildings underground in California, and it didn't really make sense to me. But then once you think about it, and even reports of, I think it was in Kentucky, they seized, I think something close to 20,000 full auto parts for for weapons, for rifles that were coming in from China. And I thought, well, why is China bringing, unless they want to use it to destabilize, put those guns on the street? But is there something that's more nefarious? Is there a bigger plan involved in
Yeah,
that?
yeah, I believe there's a bigger plan, and I have things I can't talk about yet. But yeah, they were, and the good news, like about the virus, was that didn't work as good as they thought. The good news about this is their attempt to get us to fight with each other over the election didn't happen. And I see signs that even those corrupt people in Washington, and there's corrupt, by the way, on both political parties. There's people who've been corrupted by our
Yeah.
foreign enemies. Um, these guys are starting to beginning to understand the game and dragging their feet. And so even that part of their plan has friction. Clausewitz, the great writer on war, said the biggest problem with plans and warfare is what he called friction. Everything doesn't work out. You got Murphy's Law. We have that famous thing about Murphy's Law. Anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Well, things are going wrong with their plan, and I'm hoping that we have time to wake the American people and tell them, look, we got a real threat from Russia and China. We need to unify. We need to cut out this business. We need to follow our constitutional process. Yeah, whatever court or whatever process we need to work out the corruption problem, we do need to fix all that. But let's focus on, we got Russia and China mobilizing unprecedented air activity in both countries. They're training their militaries. There's massive rotating mobilizations. Their military districts are at high state of readiness. This is higher in some areas of activity than any time during the Cold War. Russian submarine activity in the Atlantic has gone through the roof. The British are screaming like, what's going on? We have been caught without being armed fully, because we would arm for a war in Korea or a war with Iran or maybe a problem with China, but not for China and Russia and all the above all at once. This is not
Especially on
anything
our
we've
own
prepared
soil
for.
like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that in a previous interview I saw recently that there has been a shift in the political arena. Not, I can't necessarily, what I'm seeing, not in Biden's perspective. And you probably have some thoughts to share about him, but more so that certain people within the White House are realizing, hold on, wait, this is now a very big threat at our front door that we have to do something about.
Yeah, very encouraging signs of political realism from the Democratic Party and from people on the left. It's like when you are a foreign power and you've infiltrated or corrupted officials in the Democratic and the Republican parties, you can kind of count on them to a certain point, but there's a certain point at which people go, wait a minute, I can't let them use me in this way because it could destroy my family or my country. It's one thing if you're taking a bribe. There's people that will turn themselves in. There are people that will, and there's also the fellow travelers and the others that are being manipulated that suddenly stop being manipulable because most of it is done by, you got two people in an organization that are the spies and they're manipulating like 100 people who are the useful idiots. And suddenly enough information goes a certain way, and those useful idiots are like not being manipulable anymore. So what's happened in Washington, like you've got somebody like Roger Robinson, who's been working for many years to say, look, we can't be engaged with China like this economically. They're into our economy. They can damage our economy. They're on the stock exchange. They're in our banks. They can really, they're an enemy. And we have to wake up to this fact and we can't be engaged with them like this. And, he was getting nowhere. He was getting, even the Trump Treasury Department, the Treasury Secretary was like taking China's side. And now in the Biden administration, they've seen things like that Anchorage meeting where the Chinese treated them like they were supposed to be their lackeys.
Oh,
People were
we're Blinken
shocked.
just almost stared into the headlights with that.
Right, right. And it's suddenly you got this wake up. And I was reported to me about a meeting in Washington where a lot of members of the administration, there were some of them that were arguing, well, we have to be with China. China's our ally. And then everybody was glaring at them and saying, mm-mm. No, we can't because they're realizing the virus, the COVID-19 virus was made in a lab. It was a weapon. It was made for us. And a lot of these people are thinking the Chinese New Year's thing. I just told you, they might not say it publicly, but they're saying, wait a minute, this was on purpose. They're doing these military demonstrations. They're threatening Taiwan at the same time the Russians are threatening Ukraine, right? So we got military pressure, and you've got Iran ready to blow up, and you've got North Korea, always that little dingbat, always running around, little rocket man, ready to do something. So it's like, wait a minute, they're starting to catch on in the Democratic Party that the country is in danger. And I think some of our generals are smart. I there's some of them I'm looking at, and they understand. They've been testifying, like this Air Force general that's in charge of our NATO Air Force. Our Air Force is in NATO. He has talked Russia and China. They're together. We know this now. And these generals are talking to the politicians, and the politicians are like, they're figuring it out how they've been playing us. So I think there's I mean, I'm very pleased to hear this. And you see Biden's meeting with Putin last week. Biden's meeting with Putin is very interesting because, Putin did this incredible press conference. They had separate press conferences rather than being together. And so that Biden, because Putin could just hog that limelight. He just loved it. He blamed America for everything. It's all America's fault. America's, locking people in jail. He mentioned January 6th and all the Americans rotting in jail from January 6th. And how can you go after me for human rights violation when Biden has locked up these Americans? I was just perfectly done to exacerbate problems. People thinking here and think that he's on the side of
Mm.
President Trump and stuff. It was brilliantly done. And then Biden goes in there, and you could tell Biden is irritated by all this thing. And when he leaves, he's walking away, and that lady from CNN is shouting, "What makes you confident you can change Putin?" And he just pulls off his glasses and what the hell? And it's like, I never said I was confident. And it's like, why is this guy, why did this push his buttons so much? It's because he wasn't calling the shots here between him and Putin because Biden's got this
Mm.
history. He became a senator. Armand Hammer, just the same thing with Al Gore Sr. Armand Hammer was the guy that really got him into the Senate. And Armand Hammer, if you read the Hammer file by Edward J. Epstein, was a KGB agent. He worked for the Russian Soviet Special Services in Germany, in France, and then in the United States. And then you've got people like Trevor Loudon pointing out how the Council for a Livable World, a Communist Front organization, really worked with Biden this whole time, including other disarmament, groups, communist fronts. So Biden has been their creature all along. And now he's looking at this going, he's in a trap. he's got to do something really bad to America, or they're going to expose him, and they're putting him under pressure.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. How many, if you had to estimate, and I think that even more so we've seen, especially in the past year, that it's not just one side of the government that's corrupt. It's almost equal on both sides from what we're seeing.
I
But
would say so.
how
That I
much
mean,
of,
yeah.
I would say, how much of our government do you think is actually compromised?
Percentage, I mean, look, you go back to 1980 and John Barron's book on the KGB and all the other East Bloc services. He said there were 50,000 East Bloc agents operating in the United States. He meant illegals. The number now with the Chinese here, I mean, you're probably talking over 100,000 enemy agents, operatives. You also have false flag recruitments where people are working for the Russians and the Chinese and they don't know that. I mean, like if you're working for the CIA and your boss in the CIA is a Russian agent, who are you really working for? It says CIA on the
Yeah.
door, on the building, right? But if your boss is working for the Russian Special Services and he's directing your activity and he's working for the Russians, then you're working for the Russians and you don't even know it.
Yeah. You
So how
mentioned
many
that in one of your
people,
interviews that
yeah,
the CIA was the English branch of the
English
KGB,
speaking.
which is,
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
So with
that's yeah.
this is it's incredible information. So I know that recently one of the big things in the news was Dong, the Chinese defector, which seemed to be mysterious, but also how he kind of passed through the alphabet agencies and ended up with one particular agency. But what are your thoughts on that, and what should we look at? How should we look at that story?
Well, we haven't heard very much, and the Chinese are denying that he defected. They're claiming he conducted some lecture the other day in China, but they didn't show any pictures proving it. I suspect that they needed to send a defector and a very high level one right now because people are starting to put it together that the virus was an attack. So they have to give more credibility to the story that the virus was leaked accidentally from the Wuhan weapons lab. So having a high level defector with a lot of credibility come back and say, yeah, it leaked, it was an accident. I know I was on the inside, right? That helps them to contain the damage while they're trying to play out their strategy against us.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, and one question that I want to touch upon quickly was that we're seeing that there was, I mean, even under Obama, that there was millions of dollars being funneled over into Wuhan and funding. And was that, I mean, my kind of theory on that, and I think it was kind of confirmed with one of your earlier interviews, was that that was just to make sure that there were enough people complicit in this within our own government that
Yeah.
we wouldn't go after them for it. Is that why we're also
It's
seeing a very soft hand towards what happened there?
Yeah, well, the thing is compromising people. Look, the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, and that institute that Fauci's in charge of, uh, they're really the ones that are responsible for defending us in a nuclear war or pandemic. And if you could get them to do something stupid to compromise, you don't have to get somebody to do something they know is blatantly wrong. You just to get them to do something that's so stupid it's criminally stupid, and then you got them. Right. And so then if something goes wrong, with the dealing with the pandemic, the treatments, whatever, suddenly they're compromised because, oh, you facilitated, a gain of function
Mm.
on virus. You better be careful what you do. You better not say this is an attack, you better got our back. So I think that the problem is that Mr. Fauci got himself in a jam, and so when we see his emails, I mean, I interviewed, you might have seen on my site, the leaders of the Hong Kong Independence Party, and I asked them about the virus, and they said something very funny. They all agreed. They said, "Oh, you're Mr. Fauci. He is CCP spy." And I said, "Well, what
Wow.
makes you say that?" And they said, "Oh, we got letters. They have letters." And then they said he knew about pandemic in 2017. He makes speech, he no
Incredible.
letter. He so they have, I think, the people closer to the regime, people in Hong Kong, people in China who can speak, who could get out of China. They got some very interesting stories to tell. And I think that the possibility of compromise. Look, I don't want to say he's a spy. I mean, this is just what some Chinese people think from their information, and they're better informed on these things than we are. I think a lot of us, look, I've probably said things that were Chinese and Russian disinformation because they tricked me. I got they got me to believe something that wasn't true. I'm sure that that's the case. They lie so good and they have so many disinformation narratives, and these narratives are so tricky. They get you, they compromise you, they get you going down chasing a rabbit trail, they get you looking at the wrong thing. And the thing is, it's very complicated to unravel, all the twists and turns of what they're doing. But when you're looking at this, they're taking back Hong Kong. Why? That's their window. That's important financially for China. When I first heard, I found out that they were going to close the window on China um, 2 years ago, Christmas Eve. I had a source with contacts in Hong Kong, and they said it was in December of 2018, and they said that it's going to happen. They're going to be taking back Hong Kong. They're going to be starting a provocation in Hong Kong, and it's going to lead to that. And I kind of blew it off. But then the person called me back in August, just when it was about to start, and saying they're doing it now. And my first question to him is, well, why would they wreck their great deal they got in Hong Kong? They make tons of money, the communist Chinese do. And I said, are they planning a war? Why would they shut down Hong Kong? And he said, yeah, I think they're planning a war. And that
Wow.
was the first indication I had. And that was months before this virus got released. And then when the virus got released, I thought, okay, there's another marker, right? And then you had Chinese students leaving. I talked to my friend Robert Buchar, who made the documentary on the fake, how the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia was ordered from Moscow. He was teaching at the liberal arts college in Chicago, Columbia, the liberal arts art school. He was teaching cinematography there, and he said, "Yeah, they're all the Chinese students are pulling out." He was telling me this a year ago, January, just before the pandemic came into the news. He said they're pulling all the Chinese students out. And that's really weird, he thought.
Interesting timing.
Yeah, interesting timing. So there was a
Well,
third marker. So my radar was really up at the beginning of last year. I
mm.
knew things were coming, and they have been coming fast and furious.
So one question I have is that as I'm piecing together what's been happening, what you said about the COVID mutating and weakening, that makes a lot of sense. Why it was so strong in China and then Italy, and it progressively got weaker. But if the overall plan, as I understand, especially looking back at some of the research, some of the speeches, things that you've written, if the overall plan was that China knew that it needed to get our land resources, our land, our water, they've polluted, they've destroyed their whole country. So they needed to capture that from America, and how a biological weapon was the best option because it was something that you could clear a population without damaging the ecosystem in the process. Now that we're seeing that it looks like that did not work, what do you see as their next steps? Because if they wanted to say, drop a nuke, well, they're going to also destroy all their land and every asset they could have wanted to gain from colonizing the United States. So where do you see the next steps coming now?
Well, I would caution nuclear war isn't as destructive as people think because you can airburst the weapons. They're hydrogen bombs, they're fusion, they're clean if you do it right. The problem is the return fire. And so that's why deception is still the name of this game. And that's why splitting America, dividing and conquering America, and collapsing our economy and causing social chaos here is such an important thing that they have to do in order to make this strategy work. And attacking the dollar. You saw the Russians sold 186 billion, all of their dollar assets in their sovereign funds they got rid of. That's a sign that an attack on the dollar, it's going to be full on out attack on the dollar. And of course, we see the inflation ramping up. We see the producer price inflation. So this is a real full-on attack on us economically. They're attacking us on every front, but I don't think the biological attack is over. Just because this COVID-19 failed, they got something else in mind, and we don't know if they have infiltrated our health system. We don't know what kind of sabotage of our response to COVID might have taken place.
Mm.
So we don't know what could happen next. We don't know how the response to treating the virus was in itself part of the attack. saying that you
I
can't
see.
talk about certain medicines and saying that it has to be about vaccines. We don't know because of the corruption within the national. Look at the Emory University feeds the CDC. Emory has like somebody I know I got a PhD there was telling me that 12 to 15% of the people in Emory that feeds the CDC are Chinese nationals, and she was telling me these aren't just regular Chinese nationals; these are people from Communist Party families high up.
Mm.
So why are they so intensively trying to get into the Emory University and the CDC and the National Institutes of Health? I think that's part of the attack. And so we have to be very careful that our own health responses in this country, that we have counterintelligence. See, the big problem we have is we have no effective counterintelligence in the country. And this collapse of counterintelligence means that they could have gotten into the CIA, the FBI, making mischief in the Pentagon. We know. I mean, look at Matthew Lohmeyer's book. Matthew Lohmeyer wrote this fabulous book, The Irresistible Revolution, about how they're teaching critical race theory to our soldiers and sailors. They're demoralizing them. They're telling the defenders of our country that we're a white racist country and we're horrible. Why would they want to defend the country? Why would they want to give their lives for something like this? So they're undermining. They've hijacked the Pentagon, the Marxist, to the extent that they're undermining the morale of our own military, and they're
Gosh, which
turning us against each other, like with Black Lives
and
Matter
if
and Antifa. Yeah,
yeah,
divide and
well, if yeah,
conquer.
is if you see what's happened with the school system, it makes it easy to think, well, if they're already that far into the Pentagon, then the
Yeah,
teachers' unions and the school system, that's easy. That's
right. But
but one
if
one
they
thing
got into
that
the Pentagon, they
go
got
ahead.
into the CDC and the National Institutes of Health. Blah blah blah.
Uh, yeah.
See,
Um, one with in terms of who's behind this, because if you look at the global players, it's it's not just you see that the China represents the origin of this, but this has been it seems to be part of a bigger plan that's been happening with the UN, a lot of the globalists, a lot of the big banks tying in with Russia, China. Who do you understand to be calling the shots, or is it something more like multiple mafia organizations that are working together while it benefits, or factions working together? But who do you see as is the orchestrator of this and behind this?
well, anything that's secret is secret, and you don't know. But look, the way you got to analyze this is you just look at a billionaire. Billionaires are soft people. They're not PLA generals. If a PLA general is a billionaire, this is just something that he's been given to help him carry out his mission because they're a communist country, China. People get really confused. They say China, oh, China's not a communist country. They got capitalism. Have they read Marx and Lenin? Marx and Lenin said communism is not a dogma. And the world doesn't become communist until every single country in the world becomes socialist, and the global market everywhere is smashed, because if there's one marketplace left, the capitalist mentality still rules. People want that individualism. And so they are out to smash everything. And the nihilism, if you look at it, look, it's philosophy, it's ideas that rule people. It's not banks. The banks, look, the banks that stupidly laundered the drug money that got themselves blackmailed. I mean, some years ago, when one of the Rothschilds died, they found he was a KGB agent. If the Rothschilds were running the Soviets and the Chinese, they wouldn't have been recruiting them as KGB agents, because the KGB agent is down here on the scale. Here's Andropov up here, and
Mm.
here's the KGB agent down here. So you see, the thing is that if you look at who's going to Lolita Island, right? And Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, her father was Robert Maxwell. Oh, guess what? He came from behind the Iron Curtain. And there are sources in Russia that say, yeah, he was a KGB agent. People say, oh, he's an agent of Israel and stuff. Hey, look, KGB agents, they work for the CIA, they work for the Mossad. They're double agents, but they're working for the KGB, because if you betray the KGB, they kill you. They don't just put you in jail. And so Ghislaine Maxwell's working with Jeffrey Epstein on Lolita Island. They got this underage girls things. Well, am I mistaken about all these people that we're seeing going to this island that got pictures of this? I mean, how many billionaires? I mean, don't they say that Bill Gates went to Lolita Island?
Oh
So
yeah,
see, the thing is
exactly.
if he's the great globalist running everything, how come this thing with the I mean somebody you I mean he's black. I mean give me a break. I mean the KGB, look, I had a source years ago. His grandfather was the head of administrative organs in Soviet Karelia, and he went to his mother and he said, "I'm opposing Andropov in the Central Committee. They're setting up pedophile networks." This is like in the late 70s. They're setting up pedophile
Wow.
networks, and I think it's too disgraceful for communism to support pedophile networks. I'm against it, but Andropov might kill me. So if I die in the next few weeks, take the boy and go to our relatives to the door if the KGB comes to the door. And of course, he did die, and they had to go to another city to relatives. And the fact of the matter is that I talked to other contacts in the former Soviet Union that they were running experiments with perversion in Komsomol camps in Crimea. These rumors were running rampant in the early 80s. And so when you realize what Lolita Island is and how many prominent people went there, you see, then you start to see, the different levels: drugs, money laundering, pedophilia, um, blackmail, compromise of all kinds of sorts, so that Fauci is telling the Chinese lobbyist in the email, "I got your back." Um, this is what our problem is. It's not, globalists. Look, a capitalist is a guy that thinks that political power is money. How dangerous is he compared to Mao Zedong, who says political power flows out of the barrel of a gun?
Yeah.
Mao will say, "You have all the money. You just let us have all the guns. Then stick them up. We have all the money and all the guns." See,
Yeah.
the communists have a better understanding of politics. The bourgeoisie and the bankers have never really understood politics. If you go back to the literature of the 19th century, look, Karl Marx's great insight was when the old aristocratic classes of Europe who knew how to govern were being pushed aside by the businessmen and the bankers and stuff, it was a catastrophe. And Marx said, we can overthrow these people. The bourgeoisie is weak. These business class, these billionaires, well, in those days, they were just millionaires. These people are weak. They don't understand politics. These old aristocrats are gone. They're the protective strata for the business people. And this pure populist democracy doesn't work, with billionaires and large numbers of uneducated people following them, because you need a class that's dedicated to defending the country. This is what you had. This is with the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke. You had people that from the time they were little kids were raised up to be soldiers and statesmen. And people said, "Oh, that's so unfair. That's evil." No, they were duty. They were getting shot out of the saddle there. You look at the Battle of Waterloo, all these guys getting blown up and hit by cannonballs. Those were all aristocrats. They were the war leaders of our world, coming out of the Knights of the Middle Ages, the Round Table, the whole code of chivalry. This was where we got our. This is one strand of our morality in government came from this aristocratic ethic, and we destroyed it. And that's why these people, if you're raised, "Oh honey, be a doctor or a lawyer, because you can make real money, honey, don't go for that other stuff." Well, if it's all about making money, sorry, all these kids were raised this way. Then what? When the Chinese come along, "Oh, we can buy them, we can own them, we got this."
Exactly. It's money
Yeah.
worship.
Yep.
So with what we're seeing in America, I think that Trump in 2016 really brought back this spirit of 1776 and patriotism, and we're seeing it. I think it's stronger now than it ever has been. Where you're seeing parents going to their local school boards and saying, "Look, you're not teaching my kid Marxist CRT anymore. I'm pulling them out." So you see Americans and patriots really standing up. What you mentioned earlier, which I think was such a good point about let's not get lost in the fight of left and right. That's exactly what they want.
Yeah.
But for people that are watching and to sort of spread the message further, what can Americans do to help save our country from this? And what kind of hope do you see in this whole situation?
Well, we have to stay united, and we have to educate ourselves, and we can't be diverted to other enemies. We can't, it's not a bunch of Muslims in caves in Afghanistan that we need to be worried about. We need to be worried about all those missiles, that military buildup that China and Russia and Cuba and now in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Iran. They have a new renewed communist bloc, Eastern Bloc, and they are coming after us and they want to divide us. And they're not looking at the Berlin Wall. They're not worried about Europe. They're not worried about Japan. They'll threaten Australia because Australia is real brave and is standing up to China. So they don't like that. It's like that Chinese newspaper said that Australia's gum stuck on the bottom of China's shoes. Look, that shows you what brutes they are. That shows you how determined they are to rule the world. But the fact is, they're coming for America. America, they bring down America, all those other countries fall. None of those countries can stand up against Russia and China. They got too many missiles, too many nuclear weapons, too many armies and fleets. If they get us, if they break us apart, and so far they failed to do it. They failed to get us to fight ourselves. They failed to destroy our economy, although our economy is going to get hurt. But if we play this smart, we can hurt their economies. Will take the damage, and if the dollar comes through, the West will survive. They will lose, and they, out of desperation, could make some military moves. But if we're ready and we're united, the whole world united, saying we're not going for these little totalitarian dictators, we're not accepting it, and that their own people would overthrow them if it came right down to it. If we stood strong and were
Mm.
united, their own people in China and Russia would overthrow them. You see the riots in throughout Russia last year, and Navalny, that hero, standing up to them. That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of Navalny. The Chinese are afraid of their own people. That's how we
And we're
turn it
seeing that
around on
happen
them.
more and more.
Right.
We're seeing the civil unrest in China, the student protests. So to me, it sounds like one of the best things that we can do is to unite, but also to help people understand who the real enemy is. Even our politicians that may not really understand the threat of China, because you mentioned a good point earlier, and this gave me hope in and of itself that even somebody who's compromised, even a judge that may have voted the wrong way in November or December last year, even those folks, they might have been bought off, they might have been blackmailed, but if they believe that there is this true large threat that, is threatening the country their children are gonna grow up in, they might throw everything out and turn to the good side. So I think that we as citizens need to help push everything that way.
Yeah, in fact, creatively, what we might do, and we realize we're in a war with these people, is declare an amnesty for everybody who spied for them and committed treason in the past. Say, come on home. Just you get a pardon if you tell everything you know about what they did and tried to get you to do.
Wow, that's a very good point.
It's a very good idea. That would unite the country, and people would go, here's my experience. They trapped me here. They made me do these things over here. And then we can map the whole thing out, what they've done. And then they're dead, because those people over there, they use fear, terror, violence, deception, lies. And how long does a lie last? They got to keep making up new ones. Like Galitzin said in his book, New Lies for Old, constantly got to be making up new lies. We got to stop believing the lies. We got to be careful about what we take to be true. We got to realize we're a country, and China and Russia have been arming against us. And it's real obvious now. There's real no excuse not to see it. And we've got to pull it together now.
Wow. Well, I think this is well, I want to give a quick moment to see if there's any questions that any of the folks that are watching live have, because I like to include them in this. But it's interesting because I can say that when I saw some of your previous interviews, afterwards I was thinking, oh gosh, what do we do? But some of these things that you shared with me today, actually, they truly do give me hope. And I don't like to be the person that's always spinning, here's the positive thing, and but ignoring the negative. But I think the reality is yes, there is a very real threat to our country that's more real, I think, than it's ever been. But at the same time, you mentioned they control us through lies, fear, deception, and we are looking past that. Americans, I think people globally are really seeing past the lies, seeing past the fear, seeing past the deception. And the more people that wake up, this great awakening that's been talked about, that's what actually enables us to beat these people. Here's a question from Linda. Great question, Linda. Do you think the defund the police is planned to install federal level military police and more government control?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's always been a push by the communists to try to create a federal police force. And of course, having mayhem in the cities could be used in that direction, but also to create kind of local policing by Islamic or left-wing groups to take the part of the police, community policing. What is that? Um, so it's a way to take control of the streets, which is a communist tactic. And that way they can intimidate the people that they want to intimidate. They can take control of resources. They control local politics. They control the polling places. So yeah, that's an interesting possibility. We have to guard against having a national Gestapo. We definitely do not want that in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question from Whispering Wolf. If they want us, why would they nuke us?
Oh, well, nuclear weapons are extremely powerful. We have nuclear arsenal. And if, for example, the reason that China, when Biden talked about recently investigating the origins of the Wuhan virus, the major Chinese papers said the Chinese people need to get ready for nuclear war. And they've been telling their people that. And in Russia, they've been having civil defense drills. The reason for that is, well, of course, people they could blow us away just out of desperation, not to get blown up themselves. But the reason that they do that is people have to understand nuclear weapons. People have this idea that one nuclear weapon ends the world. Look, the streetcars were operating in Hiroshima the next day. If you airburst cities are attacked. First of all, nuclear weapons aren't really made for attacking cities. That's what anthrax and bubonic plague are for. Uh, you got a nuclear weapon on a missile, it's going to reach its target within minutes. If it's launched from a submarine off the coast, it's 3-4 minutes away, right? They've got hypersonic missiles. The Russians, when Putin gave that press conference in 2018, he said, they had missiles that could go Mach 10, and he's claimed even Mach 20. They have hypersonic torpedoes that can go faster than the speed of sound underwater, traveling in an superheated air bubble or whatever it is. So the thing about nuclear war you have to understand is that there's long-term fallout. There's almost none from hydrogen bombs. We had more nuclear fallout from dirty bomb tests, atmospheric tests in the 40s and 50s than a full-blown nuclear war would do now. As far as short-term fallout, the only time you get short-term fallout, the hot stuff that makes you have to go into a fallout shelter, is if they explode the bomb at ground level, where the fireball touches solid objects. That turns the superheated plasma of the fireball instantly vaporizes that matter, supercharges it like the Energizer Bunny. 20,000 rads an hour are coming out of that. Then it carries it up because the fireball is hot. Hot things rise. Then it falls down. Wind is fallout. They look like little metal shavings, I understand, and they will kill you. It falls in a cone shaped pattern. However far the wind takes it, it comes out from the blast site. But you see, there's only a limited number of hardened sites they need to do that with. Nuclear weapon storage areas being one of them. They can even airburst on our missile silos because they're not really hardened. So you're going to have limited areas of the country where you're going to have that fallout, but most of the country is going to be fine. What they really don't want to do is to use a super EMP bomb on us. They would go after our electrical grid, but they wouldn't want to do that. And I remember I talked to a defector about this. The super EMP bomb is so powerful it would fry the warhead components of our missiles underground. That would be a real desperate weapon for them to use. It would disarm us immediately. We wouldn't be able to launch a counterstrike. We couldn't even send the signal to the submarines at sea to launch because the captains can't launch without the code. The code has to be sent from here. Super EMP would make that impossible. That would disarm us, except they would melt down every nuclear reactor in North America. It would be Fukushima times 100. That would not only contaminate all the groundwater in North America, making farming impossible, but that water would all leach into the Atlantic, because it would be most of those nuclear things are east of the Rockies, and the ground table and they don't know the long-term effect. It could kill the planet. I mean, that radioactivity could kill the Atlantic Ocean. So much radioactivity coming out.
Because I've been following the EMP for quite some time and reading a lot about that, but that's the first time I've heard that, and that makes a lot of sense.
That's why they haven't done it. They could win a war
if
if we didn't have nuclear. It's funny, it's ironic. Nuclear power is saving us, because if we didn't have nuclear power plants, they go, why not do it? Because it would just knock the grid out and we would all die, and they would just come and take everything. That would be easy for them. But the problem is that the mess would be, see,
global,
because remember,
catastrophe.
fusion is cold. If fusion is clean, fission is dirty. All nuclear power plants are fission. One nuclear power plant, depending on its cycle of its that it's in, could have much more long-term isotopic radiation than many full-blown nuclear wars in terms of what it would do
Mm,
to the environment. And animals move around. They get into the biosystem, they get carried around by animals or insects or people. They could end up, I mean, once you contaminated the planet with isotopes that last, strontium 90, cesium 137 destroys the cesium, gets into the thyroid, destroys it, strontium gets into the bones. If you get enough of that in the planet, yeah, eventually you'll kill all life on Earth if you get enough of that.
I see. Counterproductive.
Right? Very
Here's a question.
counterproductive.
Do you think enlisted American patriots have a handle on this, meaning the actions to prevent a total takeover?
Okay. A total, what does he mean? You mean the Russians and the Chinese taking over the
I
land,
guess
right?
I understand the question. Like, are there enough patriots and people that are loyal to the Constitution of our country within our own military that even if, say, Biden, I think set things up to stop that or to destroy that, but if there's enough of them that they would actually stand up properly, fight back, because we know that our military is strong. Do you think that they'd be able to counteract whatever kind of attack would be coming towards us?
Yeah, we have a problem in that in Marxism, you got the left and the right divide, but the people who really believe in Marxism, and they've become much more numerous. And I don't know, how much of percentage of the population really is bought into Marxism. You find it on campus universities, you find it in government. The real Marxist believers, the people that understand it, that promote it, not the useful idiots that just go along, they're very dangerous because they want a revolution in the country. They want to change the country into a socialist system. You look at the program of the Communist Party USA, it's called the Road to Socialism. They talk about using, what is the equivalent of critical race theory. They say, look, our enemies are Christians and, right-wing Christians and right-wing patriots are the enemy. And we need to attack white people and we need to attack Christians. So that's why the gay agenda is important, because because if gays and transgenders and stuff are special people, then Christians have to be wiped out because they're, obviously
Mhm.
Christians are compatible with these people, right? Because the Bible says that that is wrong. So then they use that as an attack on Christians, and then they use the race thing to attack, to basically make white people afraid to stand up for their country. Oh, you're a patriot. That means you're a racist, right? And so their idea, if you read the Communist Party USA program, they say we're getting blacks and Hispanics and Asians and LGBTQ, immigrants and all women. We got to do the feminist thing. We're getting them all together and we're creating what they call a super democracy, like a super majority made out of the non-white, non-Christian people. And then they say in the document that the problem is that that's not good enough because there's still the Constitution, and that what we really need is what they call economic democracy, which is true socialism. And in order to, we have to push a little bit past the Constitution to get that economic
Mm.
democracy, to make the socialist dictatorship, to make the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so that's there. It's all there in the program. You can read it. It's not, I'm not making it up. You can go check on their site. This program in its present form was created in, I think, 2005. They updated it in like 2018, and then they last year they put a thing for the pandemic, an introduction with the pandemic. So, but that's their strategy, and you can see that the Democratic Party has stupidly fallen into the pattern of being colonized by this, just as the Republicans fell into doing all this stuff with China, and all this free trade stuff. So if the Democrats can wake up and say, wait a minute, this radical left-wing stuff is going to destroy the country, and the Chinese and the Russians are playing us, and we got to get rid of the domestic communism, which is the fifth column for China and Russia. See, it's fine. We believe in freedom of speech. People could, but if they're collaborating with a foreign power to destroy the country, that's treason. That's different. And we have to make that
Yeah.
distinction, between people who are just trying to protect
So
workers' rights.
on a more practical level, and I'll make this the last question because I see someone asking about preparing. Um, what would you recommend for a family just to prepare to protect their family in case of any scenario? Was it food, ammunition? How would you answer that question?
Um, yeah, I mean, the big problem is you can have the interruption of services, electricity. You can have in a war, if we end up, because remember, when they're doing this stuff to us, they've started a war and it could escalate into real war at any time. And we can have attacks on the country. We can have sabotage on the country. So what you need is you want to have a year's supply of food if you can. It's not always practical. Try to rotate your food. I mean, it's complicated, and try to have water. If you have a well, make sure you get where you can get a hand pump, find out how deep your well is, and if you can pump it out by hand, have a kit that you could attach. If you're on public water, try to have some stored water. Figure out, have ways to filter water, get a bunch of water filters. And as far as, you know, uh, the know about a biological, if it was open warfare, if there's a biological attack, you just go inside your house. That's important to stay indoors. And as far as fallout goes, if you're living downwind from Amarillo, Texas, or one of these places where I'm not sure. I think that air base not far from there is where they store nuclear weapons. Find out what air bases you're downwind of, what facilities you are, and then if fallout shelter protection is a thing in your area, and most of the country is not going to receive any fallout really, but if you're in, you're downwind of the Dakotas, if you're in Minnesota, you may want to rethink that, or in parts of Wisconsin. uh, the reason is that every federal building and many public buildings made with federal funds, they were required to have a fallout shelter built into the structure. And find out where those buildings are in your neighborhood in case if there is a nuclear war, you can go bring food and water for 13 to 18 days, and then you just stay down there. If a fallout thing has happened, there's people all over the country that are prepping, and get yourself one of those wind up radios that you can, it doesn't need a battery. You just crank it and it makes its own electricity, and make sure it has a shortwave thing on it, because if there's a
Mm,
war, they'll be able to make announcements through the radio or shortwave to tell you, national emergency, what's happening. Is there some danger or hazard in your area? So being able to stay in communication, food and water, that's the main thing for Americans.
mm. So as we finish up, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. Um, One question that I'm having come up is two things: how to support you, and how to find you or to be in touch with you, to contact you.
My website is jrnyquist.blog, jrnyquist.blog. And of course, I'm on Twitter. Um, I think it's Jeff Nyquist on Twitter, or JR Nyquist on Twitter. I'm not remembering. But anyway, yeah. But if you go to my website, there's a lot of resources there. I've got a book on Amazon that I came out with last year called The Fool and His Enemy. Definitely buy that book, because it's a short read. You can read it in 3 hours. It basically lays out a lot of these things in the big picture way. And I've got other books on Amazon too that you can get, and you can go to my website, and I have a place for voluntary. Anybody can come and read, and I've got things for going back, almost 2 years, with lots of documentary, lots of links. I've been working on this pretty hard the last couple of years, and there's places where you can voluntarily subscribe to support me, to help me in my work. So
Great. Well, thank you again, Jeff, so much for coming on and just sharing your knowledge. And as I mentioned before, I still have a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of people that are waking up, that are uniting and being able to bridge the divide they've set the course towards in our country. And so, yeah, just thank you again. I hope that our readers or our watchers can get a hold of you, find your information, buy your book, and hopefully maybe we can do another interview at some point. But I could just stay safe and keep the faith strong, and I think we'll get through this.
thanks for having me.